Larry and I, we both watched this movie the other night, and we both came to see it again. And as we were coming down here, I said to Larry, I could see this movie once or twice a week. What is it about this, Larry, that journalists like ourselves love this movie so much?
Well, I think we all wish we spoke like that at every given moment. My favorite line tonight, I've seen this movie probably 15 times, my favorite line tonight was, "Don't get your messages eyelashes." I thought that's the greatest line ever. I'm going to start calling people eyelashes from now on.
That's right. I like "You're blind, Mr. Magoo."
Yeah. So I think it's that. It's also, while it's obviously dramatic, it's very similar to the way that world works. I mean, it's obviously, at the end, it's much more vicious and nasty. But the notion of items and press agents and power and the way that symbiotic world and how it feeds off each other is very, very accurate.
And you, as the editor of People, in this celebrity-driven culture, you deal with publicists all the time.
Sure.
And I guess one of the dirty little secrets that this movie showed is that many of us cannot do our job without the help of publicists. You have to make these deals all the time, do you not?
Well, because they're the gatekeepers. I mean, you know, that world is somewhat anachronistic about, you know, the idea about jokes and this comic at a club and all that. So that is of time. But the idea that these people represent people and are the gatekeepers for news is absolutely true. You know, one of the things that's telling in the movie, again, when you watch it again, is that all JJ talks to are press agents. There's a scene with a senator, but everything is through this, you know, transactional, this kind of scrim between the Sydneys of the world, right? That's how he gets his information. And the guy who calls from LA, the invisible guy who's sentenced to death, is also a press agent. It's all about that. There's very little interaction with real people. So yeah, the truth of the matter is that that's how you get the vast, vast majority of it. It's a machine, and one that, from where you and I sit, we try to make as honest and real as possible, but it is a machine that has been going on for a very, very long time.
Yeah, one of the things, though, that strikes me as changed, especially in the Hollywood world, in this world, the J.J. Hunsekers, the columnists, have the upper hand over the publicists. But one gets the sense now that the publicists often have the upper hand over the editors and reporters, that they are the gatekeepers to these celebrities, and that they can, you know, force you to make the deals if you want access to these people.
I think if you asked that question 10 years ago, I would have agreed with you. I think now, with the explosion of digital outlets and television and other places, not necessarily for the betterment of journalism, but the idea that publicists and celebrities have that power, I think, has been really, really changed. It's a realm that we at People and you at the Post don't necessarily delve into, but the whole democratization of how information goes out has changed that. I mean, there may be something that becomes viral or that is printed, let's say, in a British newspaper. You know, one of the great things about, one of the interesting things about how things have changed is that the Brits, for example, are much more pugnacious about what they print. Yeah. And in the old days, of course, you would never see that because it would be in a British newspaper. Now it's on a website. You can go to the Daily Mail, you can go to the Sun, and all of this is much, much more fast-moving. So I think they have lost a lot of that power because information can just seep out anywhere, you know, from People to the Post to TMZ to the Sun.
Or to, you know, anybody who's got a cell phone camera who's at a club where a celebrity falls down on his or her face.
I mean, TMZ has made a career out of that.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of parceling out of information and access was much more powerful 10 or so years ago. Because the fact of the matter is, a lot of these websites and publications are successful without any access whatsoever, right? I mean, they don't need to be in somebody's house. That's still, for People magazine, at least for the magazine part, is still the coin of the realm, and we can navigate that. Other people know they'll never get any access, so they don't care. And what they're doing is not necessarily journalism, it's entertainment.
Yeah, and running celebrities down just sort of for sport, a lot of these places do.
Absolutely.
When you say you navigate these things for this kind of access, can you give us a sense of how you might deal with a big celebrity and the publicist to get, I don't know, the first pictures of a baby or something like that?
Well, it depends on who the person is and where they're sort of fitting in the firmament, number one. It also has something to do with where they're at and what they want to do. We may want to speak to a certain person at this moment because they're in the news for some reason. They may say, well, I don't want to do that. I want to wait till I have a project. We trade in large measure on the reputation of the magazine and the power of the magazine. We may say, well, let's do something now, and then maybe when you have your project, we'll come back and we'll revisit that. I don't think there's anything nefarious there. I think that person's project, the fact of the matter is, since we want to talk to them now, may indicate that we want to speak to them later on. In the case of wedding pictures or baby pictures, there's been a lot written in the past about how we pay for those things. and that generally is written about or discussed in a kind of derisive manner.
Do you pay for
We
baby
pay
pictures?
for photographs, sure. I'd rather not, but I make a distinction between doing something like that and doing what is commonly thought of as checkbook journalism, where you pay people for access to a story. In the case of a wedding or a baby photograph, us paying for that doesn't change the reality of that thing having occurred, right? They got married, they had a baby. So they're selling that event. That to me is different than say, hey, you were the witness to a crime, or hey, you were so-and-so's mistress, I'll write you a check. It seems to me the implication there is the bigger the check, the more the story, and you don't know if the story's true.
Right.
So it's not so much about the magazine or the publication or the website, it's about the reader. Can the reader believe the information that's there? And in the case of a wedding photo or a baby photo, the proof is in the photograph.
Can you give us a ballpark figure for what the going rate would be for a celebrity's baby picture right now?
Absolutely not.
Fair enough. When you say you pay for the pictures, though, there are some publications that pay their sources,
Yep.
that pay information.
That's
I think
right.
I think the Star, those tabloids, they pay the hospital workers, they pay people who've worked in celebrity homes. Do mainstream magazines like People pay for that kind of information?
No. Well, I can't speak for other magazines or news organizations, but we don't. Because it's a slippery slope that you can never get out of. I mean, first of all, the amount of money you'd be spending is, well, it's infinite, I suppose. The other is you just don't know, you're damaging your relationship with the reader. Because they don't know whether or not this person is being paid, if what they're telling you is the truth. Are they telling you this because they're getting paid? It's not something that we feel the need for. And I know there's been a lot of conversations about this, and obviously I've been on stories when I was a reporter at the news with British reporters. I was in Waco and Mike Tyson's rape trial and all kinds of crazy stories that the Brits loved. And it was, I mean, they knew how to write and report, and they also knew how to buy stories. It was a skill that American journalists didn't have, but they would buy up families and fly them out to Waco, for example, where they would be there when the English family was released from the compound, or whatever it may be. It's completely routine there. They see nothing wrong with it. It's the price of competition, and they're kind of open about it. It's one of those things that has just never come over here, and I kind of hope it doesn't. It's interesting, you don't see that in this movie either. You don't see any naked transaction. You see, people being pimped out for, column items, but you don't see money.
Well,
so maybe it's okay.
I think, I think though that's because the power that these columnists had back then, none of us in the newspapers certainly had that kind of power anymore. And J.J. Hunsaker, as I'm sure many of you know, was based on Walter Winchell, who had a readership and a listenership on his radio of 70 million people at a time when the country had about 100 million people in it.
Yeah.
So, 2/3 of the country listened to what this man said, and you see Hunsaker talking with the senator. Winchell's great friends were Franklin Roosevelt and J. Edgar Hoover. That's how powerful this guy was back then.
And if I'm not mistaken, the idea, this movie was made by Burt Lancaster's production company in 1957. I think the idea of making this picture about Winchell, who was still very powerful, was pretty nervy. I mean, he was taking on a guy who, resembles in some ways some, personalities that are on television now. And he didn't have to do that, and he chose to. So I think there's a backstory there about his decision to do that.
That's right. The Lehman, one of the writers of the movie, was Clifford Odets and Ernest Lehman, I think. Lehman had been a publicist, so he knew the racket. He knew the ins and outs. And he got out of the business, and he wrote a series of short stories about this powerful gossip columnist, J.J. Hunsaker, based on Walter Winchell. And when Winchell found out about those stories, Winchell tried to destroy his career. And it was only because Lancaster was a powerful movie star then, and Tony Curtis, who had been doing a lot of kind of fluffy teenage girl movies and wanted to change his career and be taken seriously. It was only because these two powerful Hollywood guys decided that this was an interesting world that they bought those short stories and made this movie. And they brought Odets on, Clifford Odets, who of course came from the theater, to write this brilliant, brilliant dialogue. And the stories Tony Curtis once told me, I interviewed him about this movie, and he said they filmed the movie in the winter in New York. And if you notice, most of the movie takes place at night because these are creatures of the night, these people. In fact, the only time you really see the sun come up is when the sister
At the very end.
leaves,
That's right.
walks away.
That's right.
And while they were filming this movie in a January, February night, Odets was in a trailer changing the script and banging out the dialogue. So that's why the dialogue has a real immediate kind of a feel.
Yeah, it's incredibly crackling. And again, the movie you saw before, did everybody here see here Network too? Yeah. Yeah, is equally as crackling.
Paddy Chayefsky, again, a man who came from the theater. One of the things that I find interesting about both of these movies is you never see movies today where, especially in Network, people have long speeches.
Yeah.
Long, compelling, dramatic speeches where the camera is just, on Peter Finch or on William Holden for a long, long time. I saw Contagion recently, and nobody has more than 30 seconds worth of dialogue because it moves so quickly now.
Right.
We'll talk about Network, I think, for those of you who saw it. There's a character in that movie named Hackett.
I know.
the evil corporate guy who's taking
He's
over.
pulling his vest down. I like
yeah,
that.
were you named after that guy?
No, but interestingly enough, I'm not sure how many people were here last night. I'm told that the paper screened last night.
Yeah, yeah.
And in fact, my son is the character Henry Hackett is named after me.
The Michael Keaton character.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I liked the name Henry Hackett so much that I named my son Henry Hackett. So
it's better to be
I don't know
named-
why there's always Hacketts in journalism movies, but there are.
Hack.
But I think that's where it comes from.
That has
actually.
something to do with it.
The Brits call reporters hacks. So
That's right.
That's where it comes from.
Both of these movies, they do not show our profession in the very best of light, though.
No.
Is that, clearly, with all the polls that are taken now, the media ranks there with Congress pretty much now. Why is that, do you think? Why is this profession, which people want and seem to need, but they also despise and have contempt for?
Oh, gosh. That's a whole separate session, isn't it?
Take a shot.
I think because there may be a lack of transparency in what's going on. I think that people feel that certain groups, certain journalists are carrying water for certain organizations. I think because they want journalism to be playing to their better natures, and I think, frankly, the coverage of celebrity and things that are seen as insignificant starts to bother them. There's that scene talking about a speech where Faye Dunaway first goes into Bill Holden's office and talks about what's on the show. And it sounds like what network news is, what's on network news now, right? I mean, basically she says, you're putting on this video of X because it's good video, and you have a dog and a puppy and a kid. I was particularly chilled when she says, and a sick kid. I'm like, ooh, we do a lot of sick kids at People Magazine. And so I think that's what it is. I think, you compare this to All the President's Men, which was made, I think, 2 years later. And it's a completely different POV. And there's a couple of other movies like that that do that. But it seems to me that the more popular journalism movies are ones about us behaving badly. Absence of Malice is just, the Sally Field character is despicable in that movie.
Yeah, and George Sanders as the powerful critic Addison DeWitt in All About Eve. I mean, this is how people do
Ace in the
us.
Hole. You ever see Ace in the Hole?
Oh, yeah,
Billy
absolutely.
Wilder movie. I mean, terrible, horrible behavior.
Brilliant. There is something that both of these movies, though, seem to say about our profession, which that it stamps out our humanity. Faye Dunaway and Sidney Falco are the same characters, and they have, as Hunsaker says to Sidney Falco, you have no humanity left. And William Holden says to Faye Dunaway, you have no humanity left. Again, there's this impression that we are these kind of hacks that are there just to kind of suck the stories out of people.
Or it's their cautionary tales to tell us as viewers, don't let this happen, that they're human just like anybody else, and they can be dazzled by what goes on. And, you could arguably say that in real life, what has been accused of occurring at Murdoch newspapers, for example. I'm not picking on Murdoch. In fact, I just want to say that I find that story compelling because having worked at newspapers where Michael has worked and others, the idea that the news of the story in the summertime was that the news of the world was just this incredibly corrupt place and these people were behaving like monsters. What happened at the news of the world was that the culture of what was right and wrong became completely warped. The people who work at that newspaper are not unusually evil, right? What went on there is what goes on with these people in this movie. Their point of reference gets so twisted that the idea of getting the story trumps all things. And they don't think of themselves as bad or evil. They may think of themselves as clever and a little devious, but the degree to which their moral compass has been completely twisted ends up in, heroes in dramas like this, or ends up in real life what you see at newspapers like the News of the World.
Well, full disclosure, I work for the New York Post, which is owned by the News Corporation that has been accused of hacking people's phones in England, I have to say.
I want to say I've never heard Michael talk about hacking ever.
No. Somebody recently said, if you've ever been to the New York Post, you could tell that we wouldn't be able to hack an electronic toothbrush. We just had a computer change system, and I was using Microsoft Word 1993 up until recently. So, but this notion of this competitiveness to get that story, Larry's absolutely right, particularly about the British newspapers, which I do think function much more like this movie does than we do.
Well, they still serve a role much more like the papers in New York served that role in the late 1950s. There's more of them.
That's right, and they're still very, very powerful.
And they have much larger circulation.
For example,
everybody reads them.
That's right. For example, the Daily Mail, which is not a News Corporation newspaper, sells 4 million copies a day in England. And I have friends who work there, and the way their structure is that they assign 3 or 4 editors and 5 or 6 reporters to cover the same story. And they compete them, they pit them against each other. And then the top editor selects which team came up with the best angle or the best information that day. So it's a kind of a bear baiting in your own office all the time.
Right.
And that's what produces this desire, this need to have the story at all costs.
At all costs.
Yeah.
Because, as you say, they're still very lucrative businesses. You know, there are magazines, obviously, in the UK, and they are big. But, as you said, the power is entirely with the newspapers there. Yeah. The web culture, insofar as independent websites, really hasn't penetrated there. I mean, the papers have websites. But the idea of a Politico... or Politico in the political realm,
or Huffington Post,
or Deadline Hollywood, or these other websites that are hugely powerful, just as websites. I don't really think it's penetrated the media culture there.
I think to some extent that's because the websites for the papers are very, very good.
Yeah.
The Daily Mail websites, the Guardian websites, a terrific website, the Telegraph. Their websites, I think, on the whole, are far better than our newspaper websites are here.
You know, one of the things I do miss, one would not miss, you know, the behavior of a JJ, but what I do miss, I don't know how you feel about this, for New York newspapers, is the swaggering columnist, the person who covered, be it showbiz or the city or politics. I think one of the great things about when Michael and I were coming up at papers was the power, well wielded, you know, properly wielded, at the New York City tabloids in particular, that could be very, very, you know, you were proud of them. I mean, they could either cover, you know, Michael and I both knew Mike McAlery, who wrote about the Abner Louima case and other cases, and Breslin and Hamill and guys like that, who really exposed wrong and who changed the agenda of the city. And on a more kind of like quotidian level, covering, you know, City Hall or covering government and covering scandal and really holding politicians' feet to the fires. That was often led by columnists who really were primarily terrific reporters, and or terrific writers, and they set the agenda. And I think one of the sad things about where we're at in newspapers in the city, I don't feel that the papers are doing that.
Only on Broadway do I think that's still
well. I would agree wholeheartedly.
But Larry's absolutely right, and I think the last New York City columnist was Mike McAlery, and he has not been replaced by anyone. And Pete Hamill was here Monday night, and we talked about this very issue.
Really?
And you know, I asked Pete why he thought this was. And he said he thought it was because the papers themselves are now getting so obsessed with celebrity that it's no longer a New York character-driven paper, that they want to write about Tiger Woods and all these international celebrities. So these New York characters who were just pursuing New York stories are not as valued anymore.
Maybe, but I don't even feel the sense. I mean, look, Ed Sullivan, before he was a TV show host, was a columnist.
Yeah.
You know, Liz, you still have Cindy Adams, then I'm talking about Liz Smith. You just don't have people like that as much. I mean, you have, the papers all have showbiz columns, but they're not as powerful. And perhaps that is the reason, because half the items are based out of Los Angeles.
Yeah, well, look, if you look at the evolution of Page Six now is reading like it could be a People magazine or an Us Weekly. They are interested in worldwide celebrities, whereas the Page Six of the 90s, I remember reading it when I think George Rush and Joanna Malloy and Frank DiGiacomo were on it. It really gave you each day a sweep of the city. There was an item about something political. There was an item about Broadway. There was an item about a filmmaker based in New York City. There was an item about Elaine's.
Yep.
Every day you felt this is what happened last night.
And it was all mixed up in one stew.
Brilliantly
I
put
agree.
together. And
I totally agree.
I think we've lost that a little bit in the papers. Just a couple of more observations about this movie I want to make, and then we'll turn it over for some questions. If you notice on this theme of the inhumanity of these people, if you look closely, if you see this movie again, at Burt Lancaster with those big glasses, there's always darkness where his eyes are or light reflected, because the director wanted to convey the inhumanity of JJ by not letting you see his eyes. So you almost never actually see Burt Lancaster's eyes. And in fact, the one time he takes off his glasses, you'll notice when he's by the water cooler at his TV show, he turns in profile and he's in darkness.
Right. And his hair's mussed.
And his hair's mussed. And this was a very subtle way to say, you know, because if you look in someone's eyes, it's the window to their soul, as they say. But JJ has no soul, so therefore you cannot look in the eyes. And this movie, I think, is full of these very subtle touches, and that's why it's masterly directed by
Alexander McKendrick.
McKendrick, yeah. Anything you noticed strikes you about the way this movie is
Well,
shot?
I thought about that very thing, and I hadn't thought about that before, but I thought about that very thing tonight. I guess I keep coming back to this idea, like, what exactly is going on with this relationship with his sister? It's bizarre.
Yeah, well, it's based on something true, because there was a rumor at the time about Walter Winchell that he had a thing for his daughter, whom he named Walda, believe it or not. And there had been a dirty rumor that Walter Winchell had a thing for the daughter, and Lehman knew that, and he put that in the movie, which is why Winchell went crazy about this movie.
Yeah.
So.
Well, as you pointed out, it was shot for real. Obviously around the theater district and on 52nd Street where 21 is. It just has that great textural feel. I mean, of all the lines, the best line still is, "I love this dirty town."
Yeah, right up there with "Here's your head, what's your hurry?" I love that. The other thing we should say about Network, too, what I like about both these movies, is they really give you a sense of what New York was like in their time.
Yes.
Because Network shot in and around New York, and you really get a sense of what the city was like in the 1970s. There's a scene set in the lanes, I noticed tonight. And this movie, Sweet Smells of Success, gives you a feel of what Broadway and Times Square was like.
Was that really
in the
Toots Shores,
50s.
by the way? Did they really
That
shoot
was Toots
inside?
Shores.
It really was,
Yeah,
okay.
they shot in Toots Shores, and that's the J.J. Hunsucker's apartment is in the Brill Building.
Right, and that really is the hallway. Is really the hallway in the Brill Building. It still looks exactly like that.
In fact, on the way up here, I walked in and sort of took a peek in there to see. And the coffee shop is still there in the back.
It's amazing.
Yeah, Larry Hackett, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Absolutely, as always.